We're in part two, chapter 2. And we're talking about how people's actions in this world result in compensation of one type or another. And we said that because we have free will, so each individual can do actions, some of which are good and some of which are bad, and that will mean the community as a whole will have in it sometimes people who are good and people also who are on the whole bad. And one key problem we have to face is that in the world to come, nothing bad can be there, so something has to be done, both for individuals and for the community. Now, so an individual who is slated for the world to come, because the majority of his actions are good, and we pointed out that majority doesn't mean counting them one by one, but taking into account the relative size. But the bad things that he did have to be taken care of. Now, in this sefer, he talks about suffering as a means for accomplishing that. We talked yesterday about how that works. I pointed out that also chuva works. Chuva often involves suffering also. Charata, regret for what you did wrong, is a kind of suffering. And then in Mesilas Yesharim, he says that may very well be enough suffering. But at any rate, that's the way that an individual, the evil residue of his bad actions can be cleansed. Now he does say here, I think a few Shurim ago I made a mistake about this, he does say here that there's suffering in this world, and also there's a place called Gehenna. Gehenna is a place where after death, before resurrection, the soul alone can be cleansed of the effects of the bad decisions on it. And quoting the Rambam almost word for word, as he does so often, only the Creator knows the appropriate way in which the cleansing process should take place. Some transgressions are cleansed by suffering in this world, some by suffering in Gehenna, and some by suffering in both. And we gave some examples of that. Then he says, something we mentioned a few days ago, that a person may be on the whole bad, and it might be, this is a second condition which isn't always met, and it might be that his record is so bad that he won't go into the world to come. We talked about that. But his good actions have to be compensated. God's justice can't be compromised. So he's compensated in this world. And we spoke about how it could be that even though schar b'al malaika, that this world is not the world in which adequate reward for mitzvahs is given, but it still could satisfy the requirements of justice. Now in paragraph 7, he makes another remark. He says that in the world to come, not everyone will be on the same level. If you think of what we said up until now, this is a natural consequence. A normal person's lifetime has in it mitzvos and averos, good deeds and transgressions. In the end, none of the evil residue of the transgressions can go with the person into the world to come, so it has to be repaired. Chuva, suffering. What then is he left with? Well, he's left with the positive things that he did. Not everybody's positive record is equal. Not in quantity nor in quality. Well, let me give you a very dramatic example of this. The Gemara tells a story of someone who at that time was called Elazar ben Dardaya, who committed repeatedly, for years, committed flagrant sexual crimes. And his balance was black. And then there was a certain incident which, in a certain way, forced him to confront what he was doing and brought it home to him in a dramatic way, and he did tshuva. And the pain that he had for his lifetime, he sat, he put his head between his legs, and he cried until he expired. Now, at that point, a voice of heaven proclaimed, Rabbi Elazar ben Dardaya is invited to the world to come. And gave him a title of Rav. So the Gemara says that Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, when he heard about this story, cried and said, a person can earn his place in the world to come in 1 hour. He spent a whole lifetime with a tremendous surplus of evil, but he did that tshuva, and he can earn his place in the world to come in 1 hour. The question is, why did he cry? Why didn't he rejoice, smile, laugh? I think it's the Marshal, one of the commentators says, because what does the tshuva do? The tshuva wipes out all the evil. Since it wipes out all the evil, he then has whatever good he did, and that qualifies him to be accepted into the world to come. But that leaves a lot of empty time, a lot of empty spaces. All the spaces that were filled by evil action have now become blank. What's he left with? So he'll be left with whatever he did that was positive, but that may be a very meager accomplishment to go into the world to come with. He's got to get rid of the evil to go in at all, because no evil is tolerated there. But once he gets rid of it, so then he goes in with very, very small positive accomplishments. And that's why Rabbi cried, because it isn't a perfect tikkun, repair for the mistakes that he made. And as I'm talking to you about this, I'm realizing something now, which is an aid to something that I said. I think I said it to you before, but I want to bring it back again and again. We're talking about the Ramchal, and I keep mentioning the Rambam because they are very similar to one another. Neither of them, to my knowledge, ever mentions a very famous Gemara in Yuma. The very famous Gemara is where it says that the result of the tshuva you do depends upon your motivation for doing the tshuva. If you do tshuva out of the motivation of fear and or awe of God, then the deliberate transgressions you performed become as if they had been accidental. Instead of mazid, they transformed it to shogeg. They become as if they were accidental. If you do tshuva motivated by love of God, then deliberate transgressions become mitzvos. They become mitzvos. Now, why that should be requires a whole explanation. And somebody pushes me, I'll tell you about it. But I want to point out the Rambam never brings this Gemara, nor does the Ramchal, as far as I know. So it was a mystery to me why the Rambam said that. And I figured out a solution. I checked in the Frankel Rambam. I didn't see anybody even ask the question. I figured out a solution. I didn't see anybody say it, so I can't testify that it's right. But the Rambam does bring another Gemara. The other Gemara says that when you do tshuva, you detach your name from the event. That's what we said yesterday. It no longer is signed with your name. It's taken out of your personal history. It may be there in world history, but your name isn't signed on the event. Now it seems to me that you can't have it both ways. Both of them cannot be true. It can't be that, on the one hand, your name is detached from the event, and also, if the tshuva was motivated by love, those events turn into mitzvos for which you got rewarded. Once you take your name off, there's nobody there to reward you. It's expunged from your history. So I think that the Rambam saw a contradiction between those two statements in the Talmud. Such contradictions exist. They're common. Everybody knows this. There's nothing surprising or original here. And he decided, for whatever reason, that he would follow the statement of the Talmud that your name is erased, and not the statement of the Talmud that what happens to the transgressions depends upon your motivation. As I'm talking to you now, I realize there's another Gemara on that side, the Gemara we just said. Because if Rabbi Elazar ben Dadaria had done tshuva out of love of God, and all of those transgressions have been transmuted into mitzvos, there would have been no reason for Rabbi to cry. What would he be crying about? The contrary. His life becomes ideal. According to the commentary that I heard, the reason why he's crying is because it's done with blank spaces. That's another case where the right description is his name is erased. Not that the actions become transformed in one way or another. So it could be that we now have a second Gemara that pushes in the direction of what the Rambam said.
Could it be that he still is lacking in other mitzvahs?
But why cry? Why cry? And it's not necessary. How would he know? Yeah.
Can it maybe be that when we say that if you do it out of love, then it transforms it into mitzvahs, that's talking about after your name's been erased from it, now the love of Hashem that you have with those empty spaces will be filled with what we consider good deeds.
But how can you get credit for it if they aren't your actions anymore?
So the chuva is the action.
The Rambam writes, he says, one of the things a person who does tshuva can do, one of the things that's appropriate to do, is change your name, as if to say, I am not the person who performed those actions. Once you do that, whether they're turned into mitzvahs or not, doesn't affect you. There's no effect on you. Yeah.
Is it written that the tears were tears of sorrow or tears of joy, which could also mean like crying not necessarily means you are crying out of sorrow. So,
Yeah, right. But there's nothing here to cry for in joy.
maybe just because you feel that actually your transgressions, there's a way that they can really rise to become mitzvahs.
Okay, I suppose it's conceivable, but this commentary that I'm quoting didn't take it that way. He asked the question, why is he crying, if that happened? Yeah.
If there's a non-Jew who committed sins and then converts, how does that factor into the equation of repentance and changing your name and erasing the sins?
Some people are unaware of this. Of course, tshuva works for non-Jews. Of course it works for non-Jews. First of all, you should know, if you ever went through the Yom Kippur liturgy and you read the book of Jonah, right? The prophet comes to Nineveh and says, in 30 days the place is going to be overturned, and they all do tshuva. They all do a very dramatic tshuva, including the king who dresses in sackcloth and ashes and gets off his throne and is fasting and wailing and so on and so on, and the disaster doesn't happen. So they definitely can do tshuva. And if someone says, someone actually said this to me once, yeah, Rabbi, their tshuva could change their outcome in this world, but the tshuva can't change the judgment for their actions in the next world. Right? So first of all, that's just being made up. When the Rambam says that a transgression can be punished either in this world, some are, and some are punished in the next world, and some are punished in both worlds, it doesn't sound like that it's an entirely different institution with different rules. But then you have to take into account Pharaoh, who the text says God hardened his heart. And I'm telling you, the Rambam pshat, there are other pshatim who understand those words in a quite different way. But the Rambam says that Pharaoh's crimes at a certain point became so great that God resolved that he should be punished. And since, now I'm going to put this in an incautious way and then I'll repair it in a moment. And since tshuva always escapes other punishment, other than the yisurim that are necessary, as we said yesterday, since tshuva escapes that, God hardened his heart so that he won't do tshuva, so that he won't escape. Now, the way I just said it makes it sound like, let's have pity on God. He had no choice. There was no way out. There's nothing he could do. There are descriptions like that, but they always mean the following thing. It means that God has a priority. God has chosen that this priority should be served. And given his choice that this priority should be served, these are the consequences that he applies because of his choice. It's not as if he's under external compulsion. It's not anything that can put a fence around God's activity. God decided that tshuva should be paramount, that tshuva should always work. In logic, it doesn't have to. Crimes could be so great that tshuva can't undo them or compensate for them. But it's not going to be that way. He's decided that that's so. And now, since he's decided that tshuva works, and he's decided that that Pharaoh has to be punished, if he allows him his free will, then there's the possibility he'll do tshuva, and he'll avoid the punishment. So that's why God hardens his heart. But now, if God wants to punish him, and tshuva wouldn't avoid punishment in the next world, then he doesn't have to harden his heart. Let his heart be as free as you like. Let him do tshuva in this world, and punish him in the next world. It's clear from the Rambam that when a non-Jew does tshuva, it also avoids that punishment in the world to come as well. So tshuva is there, and frankly, although you could wiggle if you want, but there's no reason for it, tshuva is the way you repair failures. non-Jews have free will, non-Jews have mitzvos, and therefore non-Jews also have the possibility of repairing the failures that they perform. That's the most natural and consistent position to take. Yeah.
So I'm just, it's not 100%, but I was thinking it's kind of similar to this concept that if you can't do a certain mitzvah, then you're exempt from doing that mitzvah. But you have to constantly be honestly in your heart striving to do that mitzvah in order for you to be exempt from doing that mitzvah. You can't ever cease to be trying. And it's a similar concept in that the sorrow that you feel for having done an avera is the part of the chuva process, but it has to be a honest sorrow. It's not like, oh, I did wrong. Is it better yet? Oh, no. Oh, is it better yet? You know what I mean? It's you have to honestly feel that what you did was wrong and it's horrible, and then by the time you get to the next world, then that honest sorrow, that's what accomplished the tshuva. And so I think that's what it is that he honestly did love God, and he had this love for God, and it's similar to if I did wrong to my parents for years and years and years, then I did better, I'd still feel horrible about it forever. And then I did do tshuva. They do forgive me, and our relationship is repaired. However, you still have that pain.
Okay, but I hear what you're saying. First of all, I wouldn't use the vocabulary that you used at the beginning. You said that if he's not able to do the mitzvah, he's exempt. Now that's a comfortable, squishy, vague word. If what you mean is that if he can't do it, he's not obligated to do it, that's wrong. We spoke about that. We don't follow Kant in this regard. We don't say that autumn implies can. You're obligated even if you can't do it. You're exempt from penalty for failure. You're still obligated to do it. The obligation of mitzvahs is not to try your best. The obligation of mitzvahs is to do it. It's just that you're exempt from any penalty if you fail. And then afkamina, we said, was that if your inability to do it canceled the obligation to do it, then there would be no interest in my helping you be able to do it, because you don't have any obligation. But if you're obligated to do it, you're just exempt from penalty, so then there's an unfulfilled obligation. The world has a moral gap in it, has a moral hole in it. You had an obligation and the thing didn't get done. Then there's an incentive for me to help you do it. So we don't say he's exempt from the mitzvah.
So that's a similar concept. You're never exempt from feeling the sorrow.
So and now feelings are, but now I'm not quite sure what question in what we discussed before this is answering, or what it's similar to. I did say
he might not get punished, but he still has to feel the sorrow. In a similar way that you're never exempt.
Oh, okay, but we were talking about Pharaoh. Now God resolved that Pharaoh has to be punished. So that would include the idea that if he does tshuva and he has the sorrow for what he did, that wouldn't be enough. So then I was using this against someone who told me that tshuva doesn't apply to non-Jews. And when I pointed out Nineveh, he said, yeah, that only changes this world, but it doesn't change the account to the next world. Tshuva can't do that for a non-Jew, for which he had no source. He's just sort of making it up. And I said, well, if you look at Pharaoh and the fact that God hardened his heart, if the tshuva of a non-Jew couldn't change the outcome in the world to come, then God doesn't have to harden his heart. Let him do tshuva, and then punish him in the world to come. He hardened his heart because God's commitment to tshuva is so absolute that if he'll do tshuva, he can't punish him, not in this world nor in the next world, because God has resolved that tshuva should have that power.
I was referring to I forgot which rabbi who was crying at Rabbi Elazar.
Oh, Elazar Daria, yeah, but
so the sorrow is
still the question there was, what about all the time he spent doing those transgressions? Does it remain blank? If it remains blank, then you have an explanation as to why Rabbi Yehuda cried. He cried because although he's going in, now he's not going to be excluded, but he's going in with a very sparse record, and that loss that he suffered is a loss which continues with him. Now that applies to what the Ramchal says here in paragraph 7, that there are different positions in the world to come. Not everybody has an equal position in the world to come. It depends upon the kind of positive accomplishments that you had. Yeah.
source or a reference to perhaps a link or a connection between the concept of Teshuvah and Mashiach? Like, is there something should be perhaps interpreted nearby?
Yeah, there's a Gemara that says that the Mashiach will come either in a generation that's all good or all bad. And there's a discussion in the Gemara between two Tanoim, must we do tshuva in order to bring Mashiach? One says yes and one says no. And the psukim are cited, which make it quite clear that tshuva has to precede the coming of the Mashiach. So there's definitely there's more to the discussion there that I'm not reporting at the moment. Definitely there's a connection between doing tshuva and Mashiach.
And what's the source? What's the Masechet or Mara?
It's in Sanhedrin. It's in other places as well, and it's in the book of Deuteronomy, and I think in Nitzavim, Kisovo, many places where it says it. Yeah. Oh, okay. So yeah.
When Rabbi Yodanos cried, why was he crying if we already said that when you go to the next world, you'll be okay with the things that were wiped out and you'll feel justified for the good things you did because you did them and you feel the reward for them only for those good things. So why was he crying in the empty space if we know that Eliezer would have only been happy with the good things he did and felt
So I'll tell you, I didn't quite say that, but let's go through it because I think there is a hidden idea here. What you're saying is correct. I didn't really say it, but let me say it now. If there's going to be no evil in the world to come, that means there's going to be no pain. There's going to be no pain. We can't imagine Elazar ben Daria looking back at his life and saying, okay, there was all that bad stuff, it's wiped out. I'm left with the good stuff, but man, it's 1/10 of my time. 9/10 is missing. So I wasted a lot. I don't have it. That we can't imagine because that would be painful. She's got to be fully satisfied. Mark my words. He's got to be fully satisfied looking back at his history and with what he gets in the world to come. Fully satisfied. No complaints. No pangs. Right? That's still not maximal. Even though it's no complaints, no pangs, and no pain, it's still not maximal. Let me give you an appreciation of why this is so. During the First World War in the United States, there was a song that was sung in America. How are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? You have a soldier who's drafted into the army from Iowa. In Iowa, it's corn in every direction for 500 miles. Some of it's wheat also and barley. That's it, and tornadoes, that's Iowa. Could he be happy in Iowa? The answer is yes, if he's never seen anything else, never been anywhere else. But the song is talking about someone from Iowa who's drafted into the army, and he's fighting in Europe, and he's seen Paris. And then it says, how are you going to keep him down on the farm after he's seen Paris? Once he's seen Paris, and he compares Paris to Iowa, he'll never be happy in Iowa anymore. Okay. Now let me give you a more concrete example of where it applies to our circumstances. Let's imagine the pleasure in the world to come, just for the sake of illustrating mathematics. Let's imagine auditory pleasure and visual pleasure. And let's imagine a person who has been deaf from birth, never experienced hearing at all. But he has a full visual life, and he's experienced a great deal of visual pleasure. And now he's told, you've lived a wonderful life, and here's your reward, you're going to the world to come, endless, always increasing visual pleasure. He won't miss anything. Now the other guy is going in as a person who was blind from birth, but he's had a great deal of auditory pleasure. He goes in, and his auditory experience is exquisite, and he's filled with pleasure and satisfaction over the auditory experience, right? Now I want you to compare the two of them, each of them, with the third person. This person has had, obviously, a visual life and an auditory life, and he goes into the world to come with simultaneous visual and auditory pleasure. Isn't he getting more? So even though Each of the first two doesn't know what he's missing. And because he doesn't know what he's missing, he's not unhappy because he's missing it. Still, he's missing. He is still missing. That the external observer can say, but he was capable of much more. You have, let's say, an operation which could now repair the person's blindness, and you say, what a shame that operation wasn't available 100 years ago, because if it had applied it to him, he'd have had not only an auditory world, but he'd have had a visual world as well. And we don't say that because he's not upset for the loss, because he doesn't know he has a loss, we say everything's okay. We say it's a shame that he didn't have it, right? So I think that's the idea. He won't feel regret and he won't feel pain, but that doesn't mean he's getting the maximum. Yeah.
So is that to say that we won't receive the maximum good in the world to come? And everyone has more that they could have achieved when entering?
I didn't say anything about everyone has more. I didn't say anything like that. I didn't say anything to imply that. I said we're talking about one particular person in one particular case, according to the way we understood it, who did terrible things, and then he did chuva, and those terrible things were erased, but left him with empty spaces. And now his question was, he goes in, let's say, with 10% of what everybody else does. If he knows it's 10%, and he knows he lost 90%, then he's going to be upset. That we can't have in the world to come, because there shouldn't be any suffering in the world to come. So wipe that out also. At this point, he knows the 10% he did. He sees the place he has in the world to come is justified by that 10%, and that's all he experiences. He's totally satisfied. My point only is that when you say someone's totally satisfied, you're not yet saying he has everything he could have had. You satisfy him by collapsing his horizons, by closing him in. Someone standing outside says, but he was capable of so much more, and if he had had more and been satisfied with it, he would have had more. There would have been more there. So I think that even without the pain, we can say that he's missing something. Yeah.
So if you have a non-Jew who commits the sin of no hide, like let's say murder or something, and then converts, because I know conversion is described as sort of like a new life. What happens to the sin of the murder before? Who gets judged for that if it's a new person?
So the idea of the person being born it gives him a new life is limited, and it's only applied in certain contexts. Most significant context is in family relations. All family relations are destroyed, right? But not, for example, procreation. If he had children before he became a Jew and becomes a Jew, he has fulfilled the mitzvah of a Jew of procreation, because he has those children. So not everything is brand new. And if he borrowed money, he has to pay it. And if he destroyed things, he has to pay for it. So not everything, it's not as if he's landed from Mars. The transgressions that he's done, depending upon what kind of transgression it is, so he can't come in with a policy of doing them, but if there's a holdover from it, then that holdover will be applied to him. So it doesn't avoid that. It's a complex. I don't have a full grasp of all the places in which it applies, and all the places which doesn't apply. It's the idea of being a new, and not every Tana agrees on it. It's machlokes in the Gemara. That itself, which is learning Yevamos in the Daf Yomi. So, but even according to that opinion, not everything is brand new. Yeah.
You mentioned the two aspects after you do tshuva. First one, the name becomes erased from the sins, and the sins become mitzvahs. The apparent the resolution of that contradiction.
On the contrary, I didn't say the resolution. I said something else. I said I think it is a contradiction, and that's why the Rambam only mentions one and not the other one. Because he saw a contradiction between them, and for some reason he chose this one, the fact that your name is removed, and that contradicts the other one, so you couldn't put the other one in. But there's a concept in Jewish learning called machlokes sugyos, where different passages in the Gemara contradict one another. That happens. How could it happen? Maybe I just say a word about where the Gemara came from, so you understand how it happens. The Gemara is an edited redaction of 300 to 400 years of discussion of Mishnaic material from the period of the Mishnah. Different scholars at different times discuss this material, and analyzed it in different ways and came to different conclusions. The editors put in all the discussions. They're all valid discussions, they're all insightful discussions, and sometimes the discussions come to different conclusions. It's not as if somebody overlooked a contradiction in the text and sloppily put both sides in unawares. No, it's an edited version of this critical discussions. So when you see that, the later authority has to decide, if I'm going to give an opinion on the subject, which one to follow. And I was suggesting that the Rambam saw this as a contradiction and chose this one to follow. I just pointed out what occurred to me a few minutes ago is that the Gemara we're talking about now, as understood, that Rabbi Elazar ben Dodaya, that also is such a case, because there would be no reason for Rabbi to cry if Rabbi Elazar ben Dodaya had done chuva from out of love and changed all of those transgressions into positive commandments. Why should he cry? He has a life full of positive commandments. There is no reason to cry for that. So it seems to me like that Gemara also is committed to the idea that the time becomes blank. And because it becomes blank, there's a gigantic loss of the potential that he could have fulfilled had he done that, had he used that time positively. Yeah.
How would you see the Rambam explains the Gemara that says that place where Bali Tshuva stands, that Tzaddikim, I think it's a Gemara, Tzaddikim Gemurim, right, just don't stand there. Is it a lateral, place?
I don't see what that has to do with what we're talking about. I mean,
they're hired. I mean, their Tshuva makes them go up.
no, the Rambam makes, that's what you meant. No, the Rambam says it. He brings that word for word. He says that take two people.
So if
This
it's
is.
blank, then
Yeah, no. The Gemara is not talking that way. Let's say two people, two tzaddikim, two righteous people, who don't eat cheeseburgers. Boy, what they're missing. They don't eat cheeseburgers. Okay, fine. One grew up in Muncie, and he went to the Mir, and he learned at Gottleib for 10 years, and now he's in his father's business. He never saw a cheeseburger. He never smelled a cheeseburger. He never dreamt of a cheeseburger. And if you would offer it to him, he would turn away in disgust and would be certainly not tempted. The other one, who is now a tzaddik, at one time was eating cheeseburgers. You could make him to a Baal Tshuva, or not a Baal Tshuva, someone who just knew it was wrong and did it anyway. And he struggled a terrible struggle, and he overcame the desire for cheeseburgers. Well, he overcame the habit of eating cheeseburgers, and he still likes them. And when McDonald's goes for a 2-for-1 sale, he thinks, oh no, I'd have been there, at 8 in the morning before I stopped eating cheeseburgers. Right? So the Rambam simply says about tshuva, when he doesn't eat cheeseburgers, is working harder than the tzaddik. He's putting more effort into it. It's a bigger strain for him, and that's why he gets more reward. That's all. It's nothing to do with making himself into a better person or anything else. Just the effort. And we have a Gemara from Sarah Agla. More effort that you put in, the more reward you get. That's all. Yeah.
I want to try and reiterate, maybe, so the crying of Rabbi Elazar that is what the love of God means. Tshuva through the love of God means seeing your actions and being so regretful about them because you love God. And that's forever in your life. That will never change until the world to come. And the same thing would also be true if he was doing it out of fear, obviously.
Right. So hold on. So what you said at the beginning isn't true. It isn't that his crying shows love. It could show love. It could show awe. It could show fear. It could show many different things. It's not tied necessarily to love.
I know, but I'm saying.
But you started off by saying that. So I want to be clear that you're taking something back now.
No, what I was trying to say is, so you were saying if he did it out of love of God, then what was the point of the fear? And so I'm saying in the case that he did it out of love of God,
No, I didn't say that.
Fears are.
No, I'm sorry, you're not hearing my question. My question was, according to the one who says that doing tshuva out of love will transform your transgressions into mitzvos, according to his opinion. I wasn't asking the question, I was according to his opinion. Then what is there to cry about? All of his transgressions become mitzvos. His life becomes a life full of mitzvos. There's nothing left to cry about. It must be that because he was crying, the tshuva out of love doesn't have that effect. Tshuva does what the Rambam writes in the Mishnah Torah. It erases your name from the events. Doesn't change them into your mitzvos.
I think it's that you get the reward of that those averas turn into basically soup because it was very hard for you to overcome. The more you did it, the harder it was for you to overcome, and so it gives you the equivalent reward. But in a world where you're not doing it for reward and punishment, where you're doing it out of loving God, then you still did those averas, and they're still there. And do you understand what I'm saying?
I understand what you're saying, but you're not talking to my point. I'm not talking in the abstract. I'm talking according to a certain authority's opinion. I'm not talking about what we could decide is the truth. I'm talking about what follows from his opinion. His opinion is that they change into mitzvos. That's his opinion. Right? The Rambam doesn't agree to that. But this opinion says that they change into mitzvos. According to that opinion, we can't explain why Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was crying when he heard about Rabbi Elazar ben Dodariah. Why was he crying? The explanation that I told you is he was crying because he's left with lots of empty space. According to this opinion, he was not left with empty space. According to this opinion, that space is filled with mitzvos. So those two things can't go together. So the Rambam understood Rabbi Elazar ben Dodariah, like the explanation that I gave. He has another reason not to agree that doing tshuva out of love will change them into mitzvos. You have a cheshbon why doing tshuva out of love should change them into mitzvos. That's fine. That's your cheshbon. But I'm talking about the Rambam. The Rambam doesn't say that. He doesn't accept that. You have to keep the shita straight. That's.
Clear that he did tshuva out of love?
It doesn't matter. If Rabbi knew that it wasn't tshuva out of love, how would he? Right? That's not what the authority says anyway. He says that it left the blank to this. Yeah.
I remember that we said that, so to speak, a mitzvah, it chains in mitzvahs, and it creates like an infinite chain of mitzvahs. Therefore, like if perhaps the strength of the teshuva, which is connecting with mitzvahs and performing mitzvahs, wouldn't bring that chain of mitzvahs to mean.
Okay, so there are two things to say. In the story of Rabbi Elazar ben Dodariah, he did tshuva and died.
Yeah.
There was no future time for more mitzvahs. He just did tshuva and died. But aside from that, don't overread statements in the Talmud. We've mentioned this a number of times. General statements in the Talmud, I could say, almost always have exceptions. Rabbi Yochanan said that, so I'm not saying it for myself. Rabbi Yochanan says you don't rely on general statements absolutely. Here he said mitzvah goreres mitzvah. The mitzvah carries in its train another mitzvah. That means it has a tendency to do so. That means it adds a motivation to do so. That means it makes it easier to do so. It's not mechanical. It's not mechanical. That the Talmud says the mitzvah, so every mitzvah gets another mitzvah, and then when we do one mitzvah, it's got to be an infinite chain because the Talmud said so. The Talmud never said so. The Talmud says that it's a tendency that leads in that direction. But free will could enable a person to put a halt to the chain and say, no, I'm not doing it anymore. It's not going to compel the chain to go forward.
It's like the concept of the ibur.
I'm sorry?
Is the ibur? I read about the ibur in the book.
Dibur? Speech?
Ibur.
Ibur? Pregnancy? Where one soul occupies another body? I'm not hearing the word that you're saying.
I have to check how it's written in the book.
Is this the Hebrew word you're saying?
Yeah. It's a word that says that once you perform a positive action, like you create like this force that gives you strength to perform a next good action. There is a word to refer to this.
But maybe Gibor, I don't know. But the point is, it only gives you strength. But you don't. That doesn't program you.
Yeah.
That doesn't take away your free will. It gives you strength, and then but you still have to make the decision. You got a question?
No.
Okay, so now this is one other thing I wanted to do today. He says something now which is very mysterious. And I want to read it to you, and then he says, according to the general principles that he's been discussing, there's another dimension of how these things work out. To judge the actions of a person that should lead to a spiritual improvement, so that his position in the ultimate world to come, in the gathering of the perfected, will be affected by it, and how much it will be affected by it. And on the other hand, there will be found actions which, according to the highest justice, precise highest justice, will not be rewarded in the world to come, but rather they'll be paid off in this world. With not any explanation, just simply, we talked about paying off in this world when the person is not going to make it into the world to come. And he has some good actions, and justice requires that the good things he did should be compensated. But now this is a person who is going to make it. He is going to make it. And still, the highest justice dictates that some of his actions, good actions, should be rewarded in this world. That's all he says. I don't know anywhere where an explicit explanation is given. But on the basis of what he says here and other places, I suggest the following. I'll give you an example. Let's imagine, just to put round numbers on it, that the average person's life has in it 100 actions, from birth to death. Some are mitzvos and some are averos, mitzvos are transgressions. Right? 70-30, 80-20, some kind of balance. Let's imagine a person who's like 51-49 on the positive side. Okay, he made it. Over the hill, majority, go to the world to come, the 49 will be compensated some other way, and he'll go into the world to come with a status of 51-49. So he'll have the 51 of the good, and that's how he lives in the world to come. Let's imagine George, who is super productive. He manages to turn out 200 actions in his lifetime. Not 100, but 200. And let's suppose that his record is 101.99. Okay? Just over the balance. And now, the bad has to be expunged somehow, and that's going to be taken care of one way or another, and he'll go into the world with 101. 101. With respect to other people whose average lifetime is 100, he'll be better than everybody. He'll be top over everybody because he has 101 good actions. Now, taking into account the overall complexion of his life, does he deserve that position? Does he deserve to be superior to everyone else? Someone else who out of 100 had 98 good and two bad? Doesn't seem like it. So not only do you have to take into account each individual action, you have to take into account the
Overall.
Say again?
Overall?
The overall, but I wanted a word like the complexion of the life, the flavor of the life, the overall impression of the life. That has to be taken into account also. And if there's going to be a conflict between the policy of getting rid of the bad and rewarding the good in the world to come, that was one policy. And the other policy is rewarding a person in proportion to the overall quality of his life. Then he says the overall quality of his life is going to take precedence. And therefore some of the actions that he performed, the good actions will be rewarded in this world, so as not to give him a position in the world to come which the overall complexion of his life didn't deserve. So there's another aspect of divine justice, and I'm mentioning it because, he says so, and I put in the figures, but he says so, just to get an idea of how subtle the judgment is and how much it takes into account. And of course, no one claims to have a full list of all the things that God takes into account. But if you'd make what we call in Jewish learning a binyanav, if you take these examples and say, well, this is how the system works with things like this and things like this and things like this, you begin to realize that it is a complex system with a lot of subtlety in it, a lot of nuance in it. It isn't a straightforward, block and chain set of rules. It's much more complex than that, especially when you take into account the size of an action depends upon the inner character and struggles of a person. All of this is taken into account. Yeah.
If I'm just trying to nail down what you just said, that him giving out the reward is done in a certain way that the outcome of all the reward is set up perfectly. So he'll give some reward here in order to affect exactly how the reward is given in the next world. So just to balance everything out perfectly.
I hope I understand you. This is just showing that when God gives out the reward, it has to be justified by the person's lifetime. And that if you simply justify it piece by piece, action by action, you may get distortions. So this is one way in which those distortions can be overcome. Okay.